I'd like to thank Antonio Merlo, our Dean of Art and Science, for taking over. He will be moderating the debates and introducing each guest. Antonio is the Anne and Joel Ehrenkrantz Dean of NYU's Faculty of Art and Science and Professor of Economics since 2019. He was previously the Dean of the School of Social Science at Rice University, where he was also the George Peterkin Professor and founding director of the Rice Initiative for the Study of Economics. Antonio is a distinguished political economist. His areas of scholarly interest include political economy, policy analysis, public economics, bargaining theory and applications, and empirical microeconomics. He has published numerous articles in the leading economics journal, including the American Economic Review, Econometrica, and the Journal of Political Economy, and the Review of Economic Studies. His numerous awards and honors include being elected a Fellow of the Econometric Society, the Pareto Lecturer in Economics and Social Sciences, and so on. So, Antonio, thank you for taking over, and it's your turn.
Thank you, François. Thank you all for coming. So before I turn attention to the panel and introduce our guests and get the conversation started, let me answer the question, what is the use of economists to become deans? So there you go, I'm done with my part. Tonight, we are actually delighted to have an extraordinary panel to discuss this question that, as François started getting us going, certainly captures a lot of thoughts, and hopefully we're going to have not only presentations from the panelists and conversations and debates among them, but hopefully we can also engage the audience in perhaps either posing questions or also providing answers to the question, what is the use of economists? I think that we were very fortunate that we were able to get these extraordinary panelists with us tonight to discuss this very question. In alphabetical order, we have Alessandra Cassela, who's at Columbia University. We have Pierre-André Chiappori, who's also at Columbia University. So you're going to see we have 2 for NYU, 2 for Columbia. And then we have Georges de Ménil, who is from EHESS in Paris. This is an Italian trying to speak French. Apologies. I kind of learned to speak French when I was in high school, but that was a very, very long time ago. So I'm not even going to try. And then we have Pascaline Dupas, who's currently at Princeton University, but I believe she very recently joined us from Stanford University. And we have Thomas Philippon, who's another one of the NYU. He's a professor in Stern, in the Stern School of Business. I am not going to take time, going through their many, many different accomplishments and their bios. They're all, in the, on the website and available to you. But I think that once they start introducing the topic, you'll all realize why each one of them is an absolute eminent person to speak to this topic and, a lot of other topics in economics and very useful things. So in some sense, what is the use of economists? If you look at this table, you should all be impressed, and perhaps we can just pack it up and just move to wine and cheese, because each one of them has contributed tremendously, not just to the scholarship, but also to show how economics can really be transformative and useful in so many different ways. So the rules of engagement are that each panelist was asked to start providing a short answer to the question. And so what we're going to do is we are going to allow each one of them to first give their own answer to the question that was posed. And then after that, we're going to take some of the themes that each one of them touches on and start a conversation or a debate. We're going to pose some questions. And then we're going to try to bring the audience in. So if you have a question you would like to ask, if you would like to add a comment, again, at some point we're going to try to bring the audience into the conversation. So again, thank you all for coming. I'm we're delighted to see so many of you here with us tonight in this, beautiful location, in this, beautiful venue. And why don't we actually start going in the order of the table? So I'm going to ask George to open the dances. What is the use of economists?
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be back at NYU, where I taught for 3 years, and to have to approach this challenging question. I think it's useful, and we were suggested that we might each start very briefly by talking about who we are. I'm what in France was known, and maybe less now, but as an économètre, which meant that you spoke a language that nobody else could understand, and that you spent a lot of time with verification and t-statistics of economic models. And I did that. That's what brought me to France. I led a team that constructed the first French quarterly macroeconometric model, metric, which was used for a long time by the Direction de la Prévision. Then one thing led to another. I found myself teaching at the École des Hautes Études, and I became aware of the importance of looking at other countries, looking across borders. And I spent a good bit of my time promoting dialogue. And you might be interested to know, being a Frenchman in France, but trained in America, the greatest challenge was not between Americans and French, but between the Europeans themselves. And a group and I founded a journal, Economic Policy, which is a European journal which addresses that lacuna. And jumping quickly, 1990 came, and I think I thought, as did many, that this was really the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the former Soviet Union, was the economic event of our generation. I found myself shortly advising the government of Ukraine, which at that time went through a reformist period, and moved to Romania, where I was involved in freeing prices, privatizing, and doing. I mean, that's certainly one of the things economists do. Now, if I look back at that period and ask what is the use of economists, I think that the question really teases comment about public policy. What good do economists do to the public debate and to policies? And I would say briefly, and I think I should be very brief, where economists do the most good and where they're the most useful is when the issue deals with trade-offs. Another way to think about it is when the issue deals with markets, because markets are incredibly interesting in the way they handle trade-offs. And we have extraordinary examples. I mean, I think that trade liberalization of the post-war period, the Kennedy round is kind of the highlight, is an amazing period, an amazing phenomenon. It lasted decades. Economists were very prominent in that effort. And I think we cannot deny that hundreds of millions of people, a lot in Asia and Africa, were drawn out of absolute poverty by this global trade regime. I think another case, in a sense, where markets were very important was what happened after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the there, I think the economists, again, were extremely important. The first beachhead, really, was in Poland. And in the first Solidarity government, of which Leszek Balcerowicz was the finance minister and I think vice prime minister, Jeff Sachs was an important advisor. And you have there two economists who really made a substantial contribution to the direction that Poland took at that point. The story, as I see it, is not all positive. Economists have a lot to say about markets and trade-offs, but they also have made some terrible, I think, overstatements. And I think the recession of 2008 is really a prime example, and I mean, is the extraordinary example. We have more or less economically recovered from the recession of 2008. But those things don't happen in a vacuum. We have certainly not recovered politically from the divisions that were born at that time. And I'll just remind you that both the Freedom Party and Occupy Wall Street were born in the wake of the recession of 2008. So I think I've spoken a long time, and I'll stop and turn it over to Alessandra.
Thank you very much. Thank you, George. George gave you this panoramic and the great influence, the great importance, the great mistakes as well that economists can make over the events of the world. And I will instead bring it down to a micro level. So I will, since we had the whole macro story, which is so intimidating too, let me start instead very small. And so let me go back to economists as having eventually becomes instinctive appreciation of incentives. So I think economists are very important because economists are really trained and brainwashed, if you want, to think about incentives. And thinking about incentives is a way that opens the way to policy interventions that are less ambitious, maybe, that are much more specific, but can be very effective and can be very important. So if I think about, say, cap and trade system for pollution or for carbon, if I think about different possible reforms to temporary work visas, for example, if I think about advanced market commitments to stimulate vaccines and the work of Michael Kramer, which was not at all irrelevant, in fact, quite important in eventually helping us to have the vaccine we all benefited from very recently. So this is a view of markets. Georges talked about markets as trade-off, the locus of trade-off. Markets are also very much the locus of distinction between ownership and usage. So the market is where the fact that you own something allows you to sell it or to even just sell the services of it. And this is extremely important to many of the examples, like the cap and trade, for example, that I just made. Right? So this understanding of markets, that, by the way, is not intuitive. So economists are also trained to think like that. That's why I come back to maybe we are brainwashed, but it's true. And when you teach and when you talk to students, this distinction between property and usage is not something that is natural to us. And this brings me to another point, and the point, which is a painful point for me, is the fact that markets need peace. It's really important because this distinction between ownership and usage requires a system of prices that works, a system of property rights that are respected, and everything else. And so I skipped the introduction telling you who I am, I'm an economist. I guess you can tell. But I'm also a professor of political science, and I believe in political science very much. And I am closer to Antonio's before his eminent new position as dean. When he was working on political economy, that's what I do as well. And that's because it seems to me that the political side of things is so incredibly tight. And George talked about the impact of economics on politics, the fact that we are still living with the consequences of 2008. This is true, and there is the other side, of course, the influence of politics on economics, and this really tight link between the two that makes the potential and the pitfall of economics as well so salient, I think, and so difficult. And so with this challenge, I'm going to pass it to Pierre-André.
Thank you, Alessandra. Economics is extremely diverse. There is macro, there is micro, there is international trade, there is finance. Even within micro, there are lots of issues. One thing in common that has been said, but I think it's very right, is we try to help with policies, and that means two things. First, trying to influence or to design policy that can improve the situation. But second, and I think much more importantly, we try to point out, and in the best case, avoid bad policies. And there is good policies can do a lot of good, but there must be an upper limit of the good they can make. Bad policy can be absolutely terrible. And if we can avoid that, well, we've done our job. Another thing is, I'm a microeconomist. We've been working a lot on markets, and that's the point that has been raised by both George and Alessandra. I think economists in particular think about markets, and they think about markets in a way people usually don't think about markets. They are part of our, now it's become part of our DNA, and definitely it's part of our brainwashing, which is thinking about market, and it goes from some very simple commonsensical remark all the way to extremely complex questions. Let me give you an example of the first. In a city like Paris, it's extremely difficult for young people to find housing. Essentially, the rents are extremely high. The government is concerned with this, and the government decides that they're going to help young people. So what are they doing? They're paying a benefit. So they're paying a benefit so that the poor people that are facing very high rent, they will be helped. Now, if you think about this as an economist, first of all, the problem is the supply problem. There is an excess demand and the supply doesn't fall. And the supply doesn't fall because of lots of regulation on what you can build and the maximum height of buildings and so on and so forth. Now, for an economist, if you have an excess demand problem, subsidizing demand might not be such a good idea, one thing. And second thing, what happens if you do? Well, essentially, prices go up. At the end of the day, the impact of this reform was essentially a huge transfer from the pockets of the taxpayers to the owner of real estate in Paris with little, if any, impact on the young people. So that's one extreme in which, if you think about market and supply and demand, you see things very naturally that sometimes politicians have a hard time to understand. And let me say just one word on the other extreme. Here, I won't really talk about it, but I want to mention it. Very complex situation. I think the best example is the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act, the so-called Obamacare. It's far from perfect. We all agree on this. It's much, much, much better than anything that existed before. In particular, and for reasons that people sometimes don't perceive, one of the main achievements of the ACA is that now it's possible to buy health insurance even if you have pre-existing conditions, and that's a huge accomplishment. I mean, we can talk about. I've been working on what the market for health insurance was, and there were really dramatic cases. But the point is, if you want to introduce a regulation like that, you need to be extremely careful, and you need to be very precise in the design of this regulation. Because if you just impose a regulation saying it's not allowed to underwrite or price based on pre-existing conditions, that's it. you're heading to a major catastrophe. You might literally destroy the markets. And if you look at the details of the ACA has been designed by people who are excellent economists, including the late, my friend, the late Alan Kruger. And there are plenty of aspects in the ACA that reflects 30 years of work by academics on markets under asymmetric information. So I think if only for the ACA, economists can sometimes be useful.
So the first thing, as you know, economists are very savvy. So when we have a debate about what we are good for, we only have economists on the panel. Okay, all 6 of us are economists. So it's going to be an easy way to agree with each other. And the other thing that we don't, actually, at least I don't know who you are. I don't know what the audience thinks. I don't know why you came to this event and what priors you have. But when I teach econ to students, the first thing I like to ask them is what they think economics is about. And if you ask that question and then you do a word cloud, the word that comes, very prominently is, what do you think? Money. Okay. It turns out money is not at all what economists are about. Money is to economists what inches are to architects. Okay, money is just a measurement tool. Okay, so economics is not about money. It's not about accounting either. Okay, economics is really about decision making. Decision making. Why? Because we have a limited set of resources. We have a limited number of hours in the day. We have a limited number of money in our pocket. We have a limited number of resources on this planet, and we constantly have to choose how we allocate these scarce resources. And those are the trade-offs that have been mentioned before. And we choose how to allocate our time between things and how to allocate our money between things, trying to achieve some objective that we have. And this objective, can vary across people. But then because we have this objective, we are going to respond to incentives. So that's why incentives are so important as well. So when we think economists study the decisions that individuals make, that households make, that governments make, that firms make. Okay. So examples of questions that economists ask, in case like in myself, I'm a development economist, which means I study the economics of poor countries, and I ask questions like how much should how many kids should do people want to have? How much education should I get? How much education should the government subsidize? If you think about firms, like how much R&D to do? If you think about again, government, you're all familiar with the idea that government has to choose how much to increase the interest rate, for example, but they also have to think about, as Pierre-André was saying, like how much to subsidize housing. So all these questions are what economists are good at thinking about, because it involves this idea that people are going to be choosing based on what they're trying to achieve and dealing with these trade-offs. Now, how all these individual choices come together and affect the society at large and the global economy, that's going to be what macroeconomists try to do, and that's a very tough job. I leave it to Thomas and George. Macroeconomics is very, very difficult because it's so many things happening at the same time, and how they aggregate is very tricky. So with all that, so I just want to give you the both picture, because when you say it like that, like whenever I enter a taxi and I say I'm an economist, they ask me, okay, should I invest? Is it the right time? And I have no idea. All of my money is in in a savings account. I don't know anything about investment. I work on, right now I work with the government of Andhra Pradesh in India, trying to help them think through how to monitor hospitals in their health insurance scheme, because they're like, well, hospitals are like claiming a lot. It's a very expensive program. We should curb that. We want to, monitor fraud. And we as economists are like, well, hold on, because hospitals, face incentive. If you try to curb too much on, their claiming behavior, they may have an incentive to turn down patients who are going to be too expensive. They may have an incentive to charge patients for care that is supposed to be free. So that's the way in which, as an economist, I can help the government think through these issues, and they ask us to help them design, different policies. But then the main point I want to mention is that there is no iron laws in economics. So we have some good ideas as to what people keep in their mind when they make choices, but we never know exactly what's the true model. Okay, because there is no necessarily true model, or we will never know for sure exactly what the true model underlying everything. So whenever we make a policy recommendation, is like based on some, sense of what may be the true model, but ultimately a lot of, tweaking is going to need to happen, okay? Because when you make a policy, the people implementing the policies are human themselves. They are agents. They themselves face trade-offs. Should I really work hard to make this policy happen, or should I not? Okay. So very basic questions like how do you increase the quality of education? Well, it turns out that in many contexts, teachers don't show up in school because they don't have incentives to do that. So just thinking through the incentive a teachers face is one other thing you have to think about when you talk about education. So any policy is going to be implemented by agents, by people who face incentives. They make choices. This is a question that economists can study. The ultimate beneficiaries of any policies are themselves humans, citizens who make decisions, have incentives. So that's something that economists are going to be interested in. Firms are going to obviously choices also. Decisions that are going to matter. So everything essentially are things that economists are going to be helpful at thinking through. But when we do that, we don't do that in a vacuum. We use the insights of all the other disciplines. So when we think about how agents make trade-offs, or think through trade-offs, we learn from psychologists. What are the things that matter in people's, how people value, what do people value, and how they experience things. We use the insights of political scientists to think through the extent to which there are going to be, incentives for people in power, and the dynamics through which people get into power and the ways through which they can get out of power. We take the insights from sociology when we think about the fact that we don't live alone, we live as part of social networks, and how we interact with others is going to affect them, and they're going to affect us. And all of this, the other disciplines, in philosophy, obviously, is a super important one, because when we think about the objective of what we call the social planner, the government, we have to take into consideration some way of aggregating people's welfare. Okay, do you want to be utilitarian? Do you want to be Rawlsian? How do you think about that? What's your objective? Do you want to minimize or maximize the level of income of the poorest in society? Do you want to do something else? All this is inside that philosophy is very useful for. So we are not alone. Here we are alone on this panel, but in our day-to-day thinking, we obviously benefit tremendously from all the other social sciences.
Everything has been said, but not everybody has said it, so I'm going to waste your time by repeating what people have said. Just 3 points. So for me, economics is part of social science, but let's think about what makes it slightly different from the rest. Otherwise, because the panel focuses on economics, I think there's a reason for that. So what's common with every discipline in academia is, at the end of the day, we are paid to produce knowledge. So that's kind of the main thing, right? We want to produce knowledge that can be used for the future. Now that's true for all academia. So then within social science, maybe what's a bit specific about economics is it's very quantitative. And that's because that's the name of the game, because economics is about the allocation of scarce resources. So if you want economics to be useful, the answer has to be a number, because everything is a trade-off. It's obvious that you cannot have your cake and eat it too. It's obvious you cannot have everything at the same time. So the only interesting question is how do you quantify the trade-off? So that's, I think, what over time set apart economics from maybe some other social sciences is the fact that mostly for good reasons, sometimes for bad reasons, we tended to become more and more quantitative. And that's part of the influence of economics and economists on policymaking is specifically via this channel, but the fact that we try to provide numbers. The downside is sometimes people get too confident in the numbers they provide. There is a bit of hubris. I can quantify everything. And so that's the bias that comes sometimes people get pissed off at us because we try to quantify too many things. Or maybe sometimes you feel too confident in our numbers. So I think that's kind of what set apart economists from other sometimes social sciences. And then the third point is about the interaction with policy. And there, I think there are a few reasons why economists sometimes play out slightly differently from some other fields. Well, the first is, as I said, it's try to be quantitative, so that means when you do policy making, it has an impact. The second thing is when you work in governance, you realize that the knowledge diffusion, so we produce knowledge, but knowledge diffusion takes maybe 10, 20 years, but when government make decisions, they do look at what has been published. And so this indirect influence is actually pretty important. And you can tell sometimes when a question has not been well studied, the governments are much more confused at the beginning of trying to draft legislation. So that's a very indirect way that economists can have influence, but actually, from my experience, it's actually pretty important. It's hard to pinpoint exactly where the influence came from, but you do find it. The other way that economists can influence the debate, of course, is by directly taking a stand. And there, I think the use of economists, in my experience, and there I would totally agree with Pierre-André, as much as we love to think of being a public servant as showing up with a good idea and trying to push it, much of policymaking is just shooting down bad ideas. I mean, that's the fact of life. And that's the nature of the beast, because the way the political system works in democratic countries is there's a flow of stuff happening, a very high Poisson rate. So, you get stuff happening every day. And then politicians are forced to react. They can never answer. If a journalist asks them about something that has happened yesterday, they cannot say, I don't know, I don't care. So they have to say something, which means that, and that's deep in the political process, which means that the way it works in practice is you have this constant stream of news or events, and then the trick is to seize the opportunity. And then when some event creates an opening for a particular reform, then you want to have that more or less ready so you can push it at that point in time. But it's very rare. It doesn't really work the other way. It's not like you come up with a brilliant reform and it's going to go through. That's essentially doesn't happen. But then because there's a constant stream of events that people react to, that means that a large fraction of what they want to do is bad. And so in practice, what you really spend a lot of time doing is really shooting down bad ideas. And I think that's part of the job. It can also be a bit frustrating, and sometimes it gives you a bad rap, but that's kind of the part for the course. And then, so that's kind of thinking of the ideas, the stream of bad ideas is coming from governments. But of course, just as many can come from the private sector. And there, I think the distinct role of economists, and I would argue that a significant fraction of the time where we mess up is because we don't apply that principle, is we should push back against vested interests. Because if there is one thing that we should be good at, especially with numbers actually, is to push back against lobbyists and firms trying to make a claim that makes no sense, which is self-serving, which happens all the time. So I would argue that the use of economists in that broader political sense is specifically to push back against the ideas of vested interest. Examples could be like antitrust. That's kind of the whole thing about trying to improve competition, making sure markets function well. That's one example. There are many others. But when we fail to do that, like we did with the banks in the 2000, that George started with that, the crisis of 2008, already large part is lack of oversight between 2002 and 2006. And that's because the banks were saying things that made no sense and nobody was willing to push against. So that's one example. So I think that's part of the job. And again, sometimes it's not the most fun part of the job, but I think it's the important part as well.
Well, thank you all. So we started with the easy question. So what is the use of economists? And you're all scholars, and you all talked about your own scholarships. We heard about microeconomists and macroeconomists and development economists and so on and so forth. I would like to now switch it around a little bit, and instead of talking about what is the use of economists, I would love the second question to be, what is the use of economics? And in particular, the question I would like to answer, to ask each one of the panelists is, suppose that we could actually pass a law that makes one class in economics mandatory for every citizen of this country. In fact, if we could do it, for every citizen of the world. But again, this has to be something that is going to be mandated and needs to be taught to every single person. So the question to you is, why do you think that would be a good idea? Meaning, what could economics teach every single person who lives in a society? And then the second question is, now, if you could only teach one concept from economics, which one would that be? And here is the challenge. If it's already been mentioned, you cannot mention that again. So we need five.
Advantage, you have to randomize.
So because now we're going to go in reverse. So again, would this be a good idea to have this universal course in economics for everybody? Why not? And then if there is only one thing you would teach to people, again, we're not talking, economists are a selected few, we talked about their importance in society, but imagine that you can reach to every single person in society. Thomas.
So, I mean, since I'm going first, I can choose whatever I want, but so I mean, it's obvious there's more than one that you would like to put, so I'm gonna pick, so one topic. I mean, GDP per head was about the same in England 1600 as it was in the Roman Empire. So I think that's kind of the fact that every kid should know, right? Growth is not a given. For most of human history, we had zero growth. People were dirt poor, and they had no health care. They were dying young. They were living horrible lives. And essentially, all of that changed because of growth. Yeah, exactly. So now, exactly, then we can, then there's a huge question about what was the driving force that allowed some country to start slowly, but surely eventually increase GDP per capita. But that's good. It's a critical fact to understand. Like, it's not as if we've been always growing. Right? For most of human history, we haven't. And then something happened where finally we managed to get slightly better off each year. After 400 years of that regime, we are where we are. But I would say that's the most important thing I think kids should learn, because it also means there's no guarantee it's going to continue. Right? Because, so that's kind of fact one. And if one concept, I think, but then I would just be boring. I'm just going to repeat incentives, because at the end of the day, I think it's the thing that maybe we've been brainwashed. So, but it's a bit what's specific about economics is that we think about incentive, which is like second round effect. So that's we trying to do. We're like, oh, I want to achieve objective X. I'm going to push a button. I'm going to move me towards X. That's what people think. The economists would say, okay, that's fine. As soon as you push the button, who else is going to move? And at the end, will you actually get closer to X? And we are brainwashed to think, in fact, to jump immediately to the second round effect. I think that would be the distinctive feature of it.
I dodged the question about the class.
What's an history?
Okay.
Oh, then economic history, that would be my
I mean, there is a class.
Pascaline's class.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sorry, I just don't take my class. No, there is actually, I'm not very happy actually with how economics is taught. What's called Econ 1 in most, to me, it's very, very dry, and it focuses on, the very simple models and not on the actual question that can be studied. So I think if we, the class that everybody should take should be a class that illustrates the use of economics, and with all these type of examples that we may have today, without not necessarily going into the boring mathematical formula that we have behind, just to inspire folks to think about how this could be useful and change the reputation that we have. Because it's true, people don't like us. I mean, I think we should. Right? We have a very bad reputation.
I mean, they like you, but then, as a group, they don't like us. Yeah.
And I think it's mostly due to some the fact that many economists may be overconfident, so that's an issue. But mostly, I think it's due to some misunderstanding of what we do, and so even making sure that people understand that yes, we failed to forecast the 2008 recession, most recessions, because forecasting is not something that we are good at all, and that's not even our job. It's not what economists is about. So a class that would just answer this question over a whole semester to make people feel like it's a useful discipline that they should engage with. And then in terms of the concept, honestly, I don't like this question of having to pick one. I mean, it's like, if you had to pick one kid, which one would you take with you? And now, I mean, but maybe let me talk about one concept that's very fundamental to economic thinking that maybe you may not have heard about, or at least was not mentioned so far, which is like thinking at the margin. Okay, so what does thinking at the margin mean? It means like if I ask you the question, do you want an ice cream or pen. That same question, if I ask it to you after you've had already like 3 scoops of ice cream, you're going to answer it differently than if you did not just have 3 scoops of ice cream. So this idea that when you think about the decision, you think about where you are and the marginal units and how it's going to change things. So if you're already, if people have to think about do they want to work more or have more time with their family, okay, again, the answer could be very different. If you are struggling to make ends meet and you only have a part-time job despite wanting a full-time job, then obviously you're going to rather have more hours of work than more time with your family. But if you, you're already working like 50 hours a week, then you obviously would prefer the marginal, value of that extra time with your family is going to be greater because you don't have that much time. So that's this thing here. The margin is something that we do, all the time when you think about the way people make their decisions and think trade-offs. So that's something that may not be that familiar.
So as we pass on this side of the table, if you can also comment on what you think would be the impact on a society if we were to say every single person in the society now is going to be exposed to the idea of economics. Pierre-André.
Now, the funny thing is that a few years ago, Georges and I did face this question for real because we're a member of a committee that was supposed to design the teaching of economics for secondary schools. So, the people have never been exposed. So we ask ourselves these kind of questions. Let me start with the concept I would have said in sentence. But since I cannot say that, well, that's the downside. I had a bit more time to think about this, but then, there is a trade-off, right? No, I would say the market, understanding, supply, demand, but really understanding it. I mean, not simply the word market, but how it works and so on. Regarding the class, that's not the kind of stuff that I'm doing. But a good friend of mine has worked extensively on financial literacy. What people know about the kind of economics that are crucial for their everyday life. For instance, understanding what a growth rate is. What Thomas was speaking very rightly of growth. What does a 1% or 2% or a 3% growth rate mean? Most people don't realize. I mean, of course, in the short run, we all know what it means. What about 10 years? What about 20 years? What about 50 years? And that's important in terms of macro policy, but it's also important when you want to save. Where should you save? How much should I save for my retirement? Now, there is a lot of empirical work that has been done recently. And the level of misconception that you find in the population is amazing, especially talking about concepts that have a direct implication for people's everyday life. I mean, people don't understand what an inflation rate is, for instance. I mean, they have something they can read that inflation was 8% and now it's 4% and probably it's good news. What does it mean in the long run? People don't realize. So I think it will be extremely useful for each and every kid in the US to have those basic notions of a rate, what a rate is, and those kind of stuff. I stop here.
This is getting more and more difficult. Maybe I'll pass. So I think, Thomas talked about growth, and I think that's really important. What worries me is that we don't really know what triggers growth. So it's good to let people know that, it happened at some point. It may not happen again. It didn't happen for a very long time, but we are missing, I want the final line. And therefore we need to do something, or we should be careful about something. So I worry about that. I like the principles of economics. That seems like a very good way of starting. And of course, financial literacy, it's really important. So what is that leaving to me? I'd like to claim incentives because I mentioned them first. So I think I can do that. But otherwise, one notion that is very important in economics, but I'm not sure. I would talk about markets, but of course, Pierre-André already said that, so I can't. is equilibrium, but I wouldn't use the word. No way I even begin to use the word equilibrium. Otherwise, I lose my entire class. But I want to talk about the trade-offs and how they are resolved in a situation in which you have a pause, a stasis, nothing that is immediately moving because it's off equilibrium, right? And whether it is a price that equates demand and supply. So this notion that when you see the price, it doesn't represent the demand alone, and it doesn't represent the supply alone. And maybe that would help preventing the type of mistakes that Pierre-André was talking about. Or when you talk about equilibrium in a strategic situation in which, given what you're doing, I'm doing my best, given what I'm doing, you're doing your best, and there we are. Right. So this is a notion that is important because it hides a lot. You see the thing being static and you say, okay, it's static. You have no sense that there is all this tension behind, all these other things that you are not observing, not because people are not thinking of doing it, but because they resolve themselves in this moment of stasis. So maybe, given that you have taken some of the other concepts I would have chosen first, I would go with that.
Well, Pierre-André really said it. 10 years ago, he and I did exactly that. The 15-person committee of the Ministry of Education, in France, it's not quite true, but it's almost true that you can tell exactly what is being taught in every classroom in the country by knowing what day of the week it is and what hour it is. The system is an extremely centralized system. Now, personally, I think, and I think probably Pierre-André thinks, that really is a very bad way to organize any public service. But it is. And it certainly, if it's going to be the case, they better be talking common sense or some good sense than nonsense. And so we did it, and we asked ourselves the question, what was the most important thing to teach? What should be taught first, second, and, and supply and demand, market. I mean, that sounds stupid, but I guess, let me jump to the question. When we started this, I was thinking about the US. I was educated in the US. We don't teach economics in high schools in the US. I mean, there are one or two high schools that do, but normally it's clearly set aside as a college course. Well, and I originally thought that actually makes sense. But I think that in retrospect, I've been convinced. I think we would benefit by having as a key part of a high school curriculum, and I don't mean advanced AP economics that helps you get into college, but I mean, in the 10th, 11th grades, supply and demand. And the concept that I would try to tease out of a class is the efficiency of the market. What does the market do and what does it not do? What does it do better than central planning and what does it not do as well as other systems? So I mean, again, I don't want to, I could keep on.
I think that this is the beginning of a debate. Alessandra wants to add something, and then Pascaline wants to add something.
So yes, but what I wanted to add is not really related to what Georges just said, with which I completely agree. Is related to something that Thomas said, which is the importance of the quantitative aspects in economics. And this is a question for everybody. I think that something is changing in the way economics is using quantitative methods, and I think it's quite radical. We are moving away from math towards engineering. So what is happening is this abundance of data has come to economics, of course, right? And so while before people had to know their mathematical methods really well and be really smart to extract information from very little data, Now they have to be really good data processors, very good engineers, because they are submerged by data. And I have the impression that math per se is becoming less important relative to data. And data is also turning us into data scientists. So I went to the NBER, which is, you know, our club, where we had drinks, etc. And there was a conference on political economy, but in fact, it was really a conference on data sciences. We had to choose 6 papers to present, and we had 108 submissions. Of these 108 submissions, almost all of them were really data analysis. There was very little about incentives. There was very little about equilibrium. There was very little of the things we are talking about. And I felt very obsolete. There were beautiful, beautiful algorithms. I mean, I can tell you about some of those papers. I love them. But they were really not by economists or for economists. So I just wanted to put this on the table.
Okay, since we're moving in the I want to add one thing to what Georges said. Actually, there were 2 things that we emphasized. One was the market, and the other one is exactly what Thomas said, growth. We wanted each and every kid to see the so-called hockey stick curve, you know, this kind of stuff, realizing that for most of mankind, growth was 0, and then all of a sudden it started exploding, and it didn't explode at the same time in all places. And you know, that's, if there is one fundamental question about macroeconomics, I think it's this. But I was not allowed to say that because Thomas has mentioned growth.
Preemption.
You should not have let him talk it first. I mean,
Home field advantage.
And the second, yeah, well, absolutely. Yeah. The second thing is, I think what both Thomas and Alessandra said is very important. If there is one thing, another thing that I would like to teach to everyone, it's the difference between correlation and causality. Because, you know, there are so many. I have so many examples, and it's not only, you know, the person that you talk to in the street or whatever. When I was at Chicago, I had a colleague. He was a doctor, very educated guy, very, very good doctor. Now he was a fanatic of those kind of statistics that relate life expectancy to plenty of stuff, and he published paper telling you, for instance, if you have a dog and you walk your dog, you increase your life expectancy by 2 years. And you know, that was quantitative, and it was completely wrong. It was just a correlation that has absolutely nothing to do with the causality, but he did not realize. And many people, actually, I would say most people, don't realize that you can have correlation that's very easy to observe, and it's very easy to draw wrong conclusion from that. If you take the causality question seriously, things become much harder, but it's much, much more useful.
Since we are listing things within this, the first time I'm also going to add to this idea of selection bias. You have to think about who you're observing. It's also very important to think about. But I wanted to mention something about markets, because you mentioned markets, but all the examples you gave were about the kind of standard market that people are familiar with, that involves like demand and supply, and where goods are exchanged against money. But I wanted to mention that economists also and very often are involved in the design of markets. Okay, so it's not like this invisible hand of Adam Smith that makes things work. It's very often you have to design the market, and in particular, there are many things that, you know, markets where there is no money exchange. So think of, for example, kidney donations happen. As Antonio mentioned, I was at Stanford before for many years, and one of my colleagues there, Al Roth, won a Nobel Prize back in 2012 precisely for his work on market design. And he's the one who designed, you know, an algorithm to, like a market to increase the likelihood that people can get a kidney when they need one. And it's something that, you know, intuitively is very simple. Like, if you need a kidney because you have a kidney failure, the person most likely to be willing to give you a kidney is your spouse or your brother or your sibling or your. But it's very unlikely that this person who is willing to give you their kidney is going to be a good match. Okay. So as a result, if you can only rely on this pool of potential donors, which is very limited, people who love you, then you won't get it. But, you know, if I need a kidney and Thomas is willing to give me a kidney because we've been friends for a very long time, but he's not compatible, okay? And then Antonio is willing to give his kidney to Pierre-André, but they're not compatible. then maybe we could check. If Antonio is compatible with me and then Thomas is compatible with Pierre-André, then maybe we can swap. Okay. And so what Aros, design is this market where if you have an initial donor, someone who's just voluntarily is willing to give kidney to anybody, and then you can unlock this chain. Okay. So that's a market, market for kidney. No money is involved. Okay. But then you have to design it. Another example of work that Aros has done is looking at matching of medical school residents with hospitals. That's again a two-sided market where both potential residents have preferences over which hospitals to go to, hospitals have preferences over which residents to take, and then the question is how do you match them so that no one has any incentive to deviate from the match. If I've been matched with Johns Hopkins, it has to be my best place that I don't renege and go somewhere else. And Johns Hopkins has to be happy enough with me that they don't replace me. So how do you match? You have all these preferences of everyone, and how do you match them in a way that makes everybody not want to do it? Okay, so that's again a market that needs to be designed, and that's economists have been doing that. So the concept of market is very important, but it's much broader than just money-based market.
What is equilibrium?
Yeah, exactly.
It's really equilibrium.
I would add then one thing, which is I think you learn a lot from failures, and I think maybe if we had the teaching, I think teaching cases where really bad economic decisions led to like big disasters. I think it's a useful lesson. And you finally from Michael getting deflation happened in 1930s was one of the main reasons why we had the Great Depression as bad as it was. Not letting that happen in 2008, despite all the other fuck up that we did. That was a major reason why we came out of 2008 much better than in 1933. So teaching this, or the markets that we try to design that failed, I think that's kind of, that would be useful too.
So this is actually a prelude to the last question I wanted to ask to the panelists before we open it up to the audience. And this is in no particular order. So this is a question for anybody to take. And then I would love to hear the opinion of other panelists on whether they agree with that statement or add and build on it. And it's exactly on, up until now, we talked about how economists can be useful, how economics can benefit the world and society. At most, we talked about economists who may just do no harm and sort of like, do their own things that nobody really cares about, but in some sense, they don't really do any damage. So the question, which is deliberately very pointed, is can you mention cases where economists did some serious damage? And we don't want to name names. Right.
Invite Jeffrey Sachs and that's it. You don't need a panel for that.
So if we can debate this as to what degree it was really economists who may have led to bad outcomes, and again I would love to hear different opinions. And
say the Russian privatization.
I think 2008 sort of screams for attention, and 2008 is a very complicated moment, and the events are extremely interrelated, and there are all kinds of different aspects, institutional, regulatory. I think that part of it was an overselling and a hubris, as I think Thomas was talking about economic science. I mean, the step back for a minute, 2008 in our popular understanding was really a mortgage problem. But it was more than a mortgage problem, because the fallout of a mortgage crisis had incredible repercussions because of the complexities, some of the complexities of the financial system. Now, Thomas, you're an expert on finance, but to my perception, we oversold, as economists, we oversold our capacity to manage risk. There was a period of time in the decade or so leading up to 2008 when the view was economists have managed the business cycle. The business cycle doesn't exist anymore. It's not a problem. And then economists have managed risk. And indeed, I think it's fascinating to look at Black-Scholes. It's such a brilliant insight that if you can quantify the variability of certain things, you can then hedge against those risks, and the society can spread the hedge, the risks, and benefit. Along the road, I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that Scholes and Merton won the Nobel Prize in 1997 and that we had the crisis in 2008. The derivatives markets became so complex, and I'm not saying that I think some people, and I'm very favorable to that view, think that derivatives markets are one of the great innovations because they do allow for instance, if people whose main asset in the United States is their house could short that asset by taking a short on a relevant housing market index, that would be a huge advantage. But nonetheless, those markets, because the poor level of regulation, because the actors didn't have enough skin in the game, contributed, and I don't say they were the only cause, but contributed to a disaster that we're living with politically very painfully today. So that's my example of trouble.
We're going order again. We're going
No, random.
Now you can. We should make sure there is time for questions, but I wanted to react quickly. I think the economists are well known for not agreeing that much with each other. Like there's a joke that says, what's the joke?
Give me a one-handed economy.
The joke is that it's Churchill actually.
Yeah.
But it might be a bit apocryphal, but it says if you ask two economists about something, you get two different answers. Unless one of them is John Keynes, in case you get three answers.
Yeah, okay. And so I think there are definitely cases where at least some economists are, maybe overconfident and pushing things. I just want to highlight that there is kind of the positive side and then the normative side. And we may agree a lot on some of the positive side, but ultimately any recommendation that is being made, has a normative component to it because it's like based on what I think is the objective. I recommend you do that. And so I think it's rare that all economists would agree to the same recommendation. And so when it comes to the episode of deregulation that preceded the Great Recession, I don't think every economist was in agreement with the fact that deregulation was a good idea. There's those who were, at the ears of the people in power had that, so this was the right thing to do. And I think more generally, where the best way to not be harmful as economists is to use our ignorance as our weapon, in a sense of admitting that we don't know. We actually typically don't know the answer to anything. And that's precisely our strength, because we don't know and we acknowledge that we don't know. We are willing to learn. And so this importance of data and paying attention to data and learning from data and trying stuff out is what many of us do on a day-to-day basis. When I say I'm helping the government of Andhra Pradesh, I actually am helping them experiment and try stuff out and learn from that. I don't know the answer to that question. I just know how to help them answer that question over time. I think in general, the least confident you are that you know the answer, and the more humble you are about your ignorance, the more likely you are to ultimately be useful.
I mean, I think to me it's like most big mistakes, or at least many of them, happen when people are useful idiots. There are many useful idiots in the world. I think maybe international relations and politics, you see more of them because the stakes are higher. But in economics, if you're highly paid to write a report that says the banks are fine, you being a useful idiot. That's it. You know? And so we've seen that many times. I don't think it's necessarily strong. I mean, I don't think it's more prevalent in economy than in other fields, but maybe sometimes the stakes are a bit higher because there is this, because we make quantitative recommendations, people sort of trust the numbers to some extent. And so they are more likely maybe to believe what we say. So I don't think people in economics are more corrupt, but they just, the stakes are a bit higher because there's a bit more weight when they say something.
I will give two examples. The first one is the Great Depression of the 30s. If we believe Friedman and Schwartz, it was caused by a mistake at the Federal Reserve, and they did not provide the liquidity that the banks were needing. Now, there are debates about this even now, but even Ben Bernanke, for instance, has been extremely influenced by this. And one of the reasons he was so eager to provide the liquidity to the banks when the 2008 crisis came, and it could have been much worse. I think there is an agreement that it could have been much worse. And if Bernanke has not learned from any historian, I mean, he knows extremely well the history of the Great Depression. And I think that learning from those previous mistakes helped a lot. The second thing, I'm not sure it qualifies as economics, but as a matter of disaster, it does qualify more than anything else. It's the 100 Flowers reform by Mao Zedong in the 60s. Literally 30 or maybe 40 or maybe 50 million people died because of this. And it was a theory. Now, it was not the kind of economic theory that we're learning, but there was this vision that incentives do not matter, that if you put people together and you instruct them to work for the common good, it will be much better, and so on. When I said, if we can avoid major catastrophe, that would be good. That's exactly the kind of major catastrophe that at least serious economists might have been able to prevent. And
I just wanted our audience to notice that we are not very good at admitting mistakes, because every single one of us has said, the excess belief in derivatives was very bad, but derivatives are great. So, we did much better in 2008 because we learned from the 30s. The 30s, there were mistakes, but in 2008, we did well. Pascaline says we are experimenting with the government of Uttar Pradesh, and so things we are learning. So we are all into turning the mistakes we made into something that now we have learned and we are doing better. I still insist on my Russian privatization, because I think that was a really crucial moment, right? The collapse of the centralized planning system into adopting a market economy. And we should have known how to do that. And I think we did it.
Okay, I think we have a few minutes left. So what I would love to do is invite the audience to ask questions, and we can pass the microphone around. And please feel free to ask any of our panelists.
I'd like to follow up on the point Pascaline made about economists being overconfident. I want to ask you about why do you think that often is the case, and what we can do to make it better?
Well, I guess there are many economists in different positions. I would say those that you see on TV, who are often sounding very confident, may not be considered economists by any of us on this panel. So, we have I know everything economists that are very, very different from what my conception is. And so I just want to say that they may speak very confidently, but ultimately the mere fact that many journalists email me asking me for my opinion on many issues that have nothing to do with my research, and so I never respond, makes me feel like there's not enough scrutiny when people are asked to speak on TV about their actual expertise on the domain, so on the topic. So that's I think so. I think the average academic is much less bullish on anything. But then I think it's true that in day-to-day conversation, dinner parties, economists tend to be very sure of themselves in many ways. And we think that because we know how to think about trade-offs and incentives and at the margin and correlation is not causation, we tend to feel like we have a better grasp on what's going on in the world. And that's why we think everybody should take a class. And I guess maybe that's a good thing, like we love what we do and we think it's important. But yeah, I don't like that. Others may. Thomas is very confident, maybe you should answer that.
I think I agree with what
I would just think, I think it's worth saying that this is not a fallacy only of economists. You take anybody who's asked publicly for an opinion about something, they'll tend to give you the truth from the Bible. And if we're looking for where is there a distortion, maybe yes, the willingness of the media, the appetite for the media, for the more the distortion, the better, is an issue.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a general question. So I think there is a bit of a trade-off between the importance of the questions we can study and the precision of our answers. So I was wondering how do you think about this trade-off, and how do you think economists should think of it? Or I mean, probably there isn't a single answer, but
and stuff. So that's one of Larry Summers, but somebody was overconfident actually. But anyway, so Larry Summers' favorite joke about finance is the deep inside of finance to make sure that if you buy 2 times the price of a box of 2 pounds of tomato sauce is twice the price of 2 boxes of 1 pound each. And so, for your question, I do think that this is changing, and precisely for the reasons that Alessandra mentioned, because it's true in the past that there was some time, it's still true today, and I think it's getting less and less like that constraint, which you could ask like a big picture question, but then it was extremely unlikely you would get a very precise or fully convincing answer. But now that we have really large data sets, it doesn't work for all questions. Macro, unfortunately, doesn't work always. But for some other questions, we can actually now have really pretty precise answer to pretty broad questions. So the fact that we have this gigantic, one of the plus, I guess, of turning it into data scientists, engineers, that trade-off has become a little better.
Anybody else? Right there.
I can just speak up. Thank you. Can you give an example of how rapid technological change has made your jobs harder?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no, it made it easier.
Yours, mine. Go first. Well, for me, because I try to study finance and stability, SVB, the field. So, like earlier this year, there was this bank failure in California, Silicon Valley Bank, and so the previous record was Washington Mutual, where roughly 30 billion deposit left in a month. Okay, so 30 billion in a month. That was 2008. And SBB was 40 billion in 5 hours. So, and that's because everybody has, first of all, they bank online. So there's no sense in which you're standing in line to do anything. You transfer money on your app, on your iPhone, and they get their news on Twitter in real time. And now we have papers showing that the Twitter feeds that you will see, they did feedback into people's decision to pull their deposits even faster. And so that, I think for financial regulators, in this case for the FDIC, makes their life a lot harder. Yes. Just one example of technology making our life harder. In our cases, it makes it harder.
I think that you were talking about Twitter, but yes, all the impact of social media, for example, it's something we don't understand. If we look at political economy questions and the impact on politics, there is no agreement yet. It might be that social media don't in fact matter all that much at the end, but clearly the massive amount of non-traditional media has changed completely the way in which you can control the message if you're a politician or you don't. And it's making it very interesting, but it's making it more difficult, not only for the politician, thank you for the analysts as well.
And I guess my introduction to made it easier just because this a lot of this rapid technological change is about IT and the fact that there's so much more information, which means more data. So for us to understand stuff. But I guess I don't. Maybe your question was referring more to the fact that this change also means jobs are taken. People are replaced by machines. Are you concerned about the labor market impact or things like that?
So many things
Yeah.
that are different than 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, so the process of understanding how innovation comes about, what spurs firms to try to innovate, what are the is also something that economists study. But what we call the incidence of change, so who benefits and who loses from change, it's also something that economists study. So I wouldn't say it makes things harder. It didn't make our job harder, but it just made maybe the complexity of the world we are trying to understand greater. So much said.
Any other question?
There's a question from the online audience. Aren't economists most useful when they acknowledge their limits and the limits of their discipline?
Yes.
I think I said that.
So the answer is yes, but that's true of any scientific discipline. I mean, it's not about overconfidence. It's human. Economists are human, and you believe you do some kind of work, you believe in it, you tend to be overconfident. Actually, it's a good motivation, right? If you were doubting you too much, you wouldn't spend your nights working on this kind of things. Of course, you need at some point to realize that there are things that you believe but you might be wrong. And not thinking that you might be wrong is a capital sin, not only in economics.
I think there is a distinction there between academic research and policy making. So I don't think overconfidence is necessarily a huge issue in academic research. I think the more people know about the field, typically the more uncertain. They just recognize. The first thing you do when you research, you recognize the stuff you don't know. So that research doesn't tend to make you overconfident, actually. And sometimes you realize it because people tend to be more overconfident about stuff they know less about. In my experience, very few people are overconfident about their own field because they know it well, so they know the limitation. Now, in policy making, it's different. I mean, for me, the most scary experience I had when I was working in government was realizing, I mean, I always had the assumption that, well, I'm going to propose something, but there's somebody smarter or more who's going to actually make the decision. And the first time you realize, no, that's it. But the ball stops here. Like, nobody's going to kick the tires for you. That's actually kind of scary. But on the other hand, you still have to make a decision. So, it's, in that case, I think it's also just partly a matter of responsibility. I think the issue is more like, to me, it's not so much that making the decision, is not actually giving owning it, taking responsibility even more. And that's the more important part.
Okay.
Just a last question.
Yep.
You are?
Hi, I'm not in economics at all. I'm a French teacher.
but I'm curious to know your read on the economic reforms put in place by Emmanuel Macron.
French.
I think George wants to.
I think, look, I mean, I'll take a first stab. They can, everybody can. I must say, being on both sides of the Atlantic, I often wish that Macron were the president of the United States. But I think the first thing about Macron is that he's in the middle. And his greatest attributes are as a political leader. So that, take for instance, the labor market reform. He did institute he did promote greater flexibility in labor contracts, but he didn't really go, certainly didn't go all the way. I mean, it was still the case that, I think it's still the case now, that if you or a company in France and you want to close a plant that is no longer efficient, that is losing money, but you own another plant somewhere else in the country that does the same thing that is making money, then you're not allowed to close the first plant. That's really, you could talk a lot about the importance of facilitating the movement of people, of support policies and so forth, but he wasn't that liberal. So Macron is viewed by some in France having been extremely liberal. He's not really been that liberal. He's mainly been neither the far right nor the far left. And I think the pension reform is a similar case. The original pension reform that had been proposed, a point system, would have been more, more of a clean slate and quite an upset to the system. Raising the retirement age, you can argue, but I mean, basically arguing that moving from 62 to 64 was cataclysmic is difficult to argue, and yet it wasn't either miraculous. I think that the merits of the reform was that it was neither going back to 62 nor switching to a private pension system. So Macron his genius has been being in the middle.
Sorry, no, I don't want to continue the debate, and I wanted to leave the opinion about Macron to the French here, but I think this is very non-representative of what most people in France would think. When you talk about the genius of Macron politically, this is not the impression one has, right? That there's been a certain political, I'm not talking about economics, I'm talking about the political unwillingness or inability to signal a sensitivity to the concern of the people that has become a handicap and is blocking also some of its economic. Well, so
but there's Macron now, and there's Macron's been in office, but I think it would be interesting to get Thomas' view, because Thomas served very responsibly and importantly the previous socialist government. So there's Macron initially and Macron more recently, where now he's the bête noire. And I think that to some extent, you have to also think about the French political system. The French political system essentially, the Fifth Republic has as a central part of it a very strong presidency. That president is strong. That president maintains order. I don't just mean in the streets. I don't mean, but I mean the sense that that's of some continuity in policy. And Macron indeed did not adapt the move from 62 to 64 to all of the hue and cry that was being expressed, but to some extent, that's the nature of the French political system. I mean, the Parliament was not in a position to come up with a middle road. So that, thank goodness, the executive stuck to the line. But Thomas, you have certainly a different view.
Well, he has the two important qualities. The first is, Pierre-André said, he avoids making big mistakes. And the second is lucky. If you know politics, I think being lucky is the most important.
I agree.
But lucky and
he's not an economist.
and he's over.
So I think that as Antonio didn't answer his own question, he has the final word. Last word from Antonio.
The word is thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. And as you saw in the last, that's when economists really start disagreeing with each other. So it's a perfect time to have some wine and cheese.
Sure, you're welcome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.